morning, everybody. You know, some of you are old enough to remember the 1960s vividly. And do you remember, I don't know if you were part of the, hot rod culture when I was growing up. We had a little hot rod culture downtown. And we used to say on Friday nights, we're going to go out to the Glasgow Road and blow the cobs out of our car. Right? Remember that? I'm not sure what that was. I never knew what it meant. I didn't. But today, as we were singing, and I'm realizing I'm getting more of my voice back, getting more, I know what it is. You're blowing the cobs out. If I ask you who you are, how might you respond to me? What would you say? You'd probably say your name. If you asked me who I was, the first thing I'd say, well, I'm Heidi Williams, as though that was explanatory or something. You would say the same, and then I might talk about I'm the daughter of Bob and Phyllis Williams. This is where I come from. That's part of my identity. And I happen to be a person of various ethnicities, from Northern Europe to Africa. And I'm an American. I'm an American. And I'm an Iowan. And I am, politically speaking, an independent centrist most of the time, depending on the issue. And my vocation, that forms a kind of identity. I'm a pastor. A lot of you in here have the good fortune of being teachers. It's a part of your identity. You don't ever lose it. Once you learn it, you never lose it. And among religions, I'm a Christian. You're a Christian. And among Christians, I'm a Lutheran. And when people hear those things, they know a little bit more about our identity. But, they also make assumptions based on what we told them. When they hear those things, they make assumptions. They hear the name Heidi and they think about goats. They hear the name Williams and they think about Welsh. They hear various ethnicities. They hear American, and depending on where you go, they hear American, they think you're arrogant or you're cocky. And it's probably usually pretty true. I was riding on a train one time in the central part of the United States from Chicago. Believe it or not, in order to get south, they had to take the train to Chicago and then go south. And back in the day, we used to hang out. Didn't matter who you were. If you smoked, you were hanging out in the lounge car, right? Because you couldn't smoke anywhere else at that particular time. And so you met all kinds of other people who smoked. And there was this one Southern lady, I don't know where she was from, but she says she spent about 20 hours with us in that car. And she says, I just love y'all Yankees. Yeah, because Yankees are so bold and they're so sure of themselves. And wow. Your identity causes people to make assumptions about who you are. Also, when people hear that I'm a pastor, they assume they know what that means. For some of them, I am little goody two-shoes. And for others of them, I'm the most judgmental person that ever walked the planet. I loved to go to jury duty in Philadelphia. I'd wear my collar, I'd walk in the door, and I'd know I was going to get dismissed. Out by noon instead of sitting there all day. Our identity is pretty important. It projects to people what to expect. It projects to people whether or not there might be some common ground that we have together. It projects to people where there may be differences. What might be the minefields we got to avoid when we're in a conversation? It projects to people how to be delicate and when to be delicate. Identity, it's important. 18 months ago, I received a paper from the council with some directions of what they felt the congregation needed me as an interim pastor to help with. And one of those items was to help the congregation determine its identity. I'm pretty sure I understood what that meant. And I'm pretty sure I did not fulfill that expectation. At least not in the way in which it was being asked, I don't think. Identity is important. Everybody needs to understand their identity individually and communally. We need to understand our identity as an individual. We also need to understand it as a community. So today we're going to look at what Jesus says to his disciples and to the gathered other people that are there. There are sundry other people there on the mountain. We're going to look to Jesus seated there on the mountain, and he says to his disciples, "You are the salt of the earth." And he says to his disciples, "You are the light of the world." Now I want you to notice carefully that those are not commandments. Those are identity statements. You are salt. You are light. So now you know who you are, right? Your identity's clear. Really? You're satisfied that your identity is a metaphor? A metaphor? You are salt, you are light. I had a parishioner back in Philadelphia who, when I said one day, "Well, it's a metaphor, Ray." And he said, "Well, what's a metaphor?" Let's unpack it. Metaphor. Maybe you've heard this explanation of salt before. There's certainly the salt explanation that has to do with its taste and its flavor and the fact that, too little of it is not a good thing. Too much of it is not a good thing. It ain't good for your body. If you get too little, it ain't good. Oh, please don't tell my mom I said ain't in a sermon. It isn't good for your body when you get too much. And maybe you've heard this other explanation before, because it's certainly not anything tremendously new. But if you have, please just bear with me. Just bear with me. For many, many years, and when I say many years, I'm talking about the better part of 1900 of them, biblical students and scholars wondered about this crazy little image, this metaphor. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its savor, flavor, saltness, pick one based on the translation. If the salt has lost its essential quality, it's good for nothing but to be thrown out and trodden underfoot. Now, who does that? Seriously. The way we use salt? Unless, of course, you spilled some and then you throw some that way, and then you might trot on it. But it doesn't make any sense in the context. Not in our context. But lo and behold, sometime in the early 20th century, there were some archaeologists working in the Middle East, actually in an Arab town, I think, and they saw some young children playing in the street with these circular shaped plates. And they turned out to be salt cakes. Cakes of salt. And even though this was the beginning of the 20th century, the ovens in this area were constructed in much the same way that they were in the first century during Jesus' time. And those cakes of salt were used in ovens as catalysts for the heat. They ratcheted up the heat in the oven. They were on the basis of the oven. They might be setting on the sides as well. And as happens in a heated situation, over time, their chemical and physical capacity to function in this catalytic way diminished. And the cakes had to be replaced. And at that time, those cakes would then be taken up to the roof of a house and used as tile. People sat on those roofs. They didn't sit around downstairs inside the house where the heat might end up stifling, where there was no light. They sat on the roof of the house. And they sat on top of them. And they walked on them. They were up there for conversation and tea drinking, and they trod on the salt of the earth up there. You are the salt of the earth. Brothers and sisters, you are the salt of the earth. You are what God uses to heat up the world with his love. You are not the heat source. You are the salt that has received the heat source, that has received the love of God for you in Christ Jesus. And you hold the heat, and you reflect the heat, and you keep the heat in your body. You are the salt of the earth. It's your identity. And when the salt has lost its saltiness, that's the New Revised Standard Version, when it's lost its saltiness, it's up to the roof with us. Kind of hard. Now here's the thing, it's going to get harder. You're going to love this part. This is the fun part. The Anchor Bible Commentary translates Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. Not as the salt losing its saltiness, but translated as being low-grade salt. Low-grade salt. The Greek word that is here translated as low-grade is moraino. Moraino. It is the same word as the word moron comes from. So not to put too fine an edge on it, my friends, when we cease to hold the heat of God's love for others, we are morons. I've been wanting to say that in a sermon forever. Remember, you heard it here. You didn't do anything to become, this is not a law. He didn't say become the light of the world, or become the salt. He didn't say work at it. He didn't say any of those things. He said you are the salt. By virtue of what you've received, you are the salt. You are the salt. It's present tense. And then he says, you are the light of the world. You will know how many times in the scriptures you see God referred to as the light. Where you see Jesus referred to as the light. He even says, I am the light. John says the light that was coming into the world. But here in Matthew, Jesus says to the disciples, you are the light of the world. God, Jesus, yes, but now it's your identity. Now it's your identity. You are God's light shining in the darkness. And that light is very powerful. It only takes one candle to light up the darkness. I'm always stunned. I'm stunned to be as old as I am and to still be surprised on Christmas Eve when all the lights go out and we're singing Silent Night, Holy Night, and every year I panic. I think no one's going to be able to see the words when they get to the second and third verse, and maybe they don't have those, memorized. I panic. And then I realize, my goodness, every single one of it, there was nobody else in the room. We could see those words by that light. That's an image for us. God's light shining in the darkness. Light is powerful. It only takes one. So it doesn't make any sense that having a light in the midst of darkness that you would put a cover over it. Yes, you say, I want to protect it. Somebody said, you said this, when the fans are gone, maybe we should put a little bushel over there's like a little bonnet as we're walking down. But nobody does that. And nobody does it because A, it'll make the light go out, and B, the light will be no good under a bushel. The light. You are the light of the world. People are watching us. We who are Christians, they hear what we say. They see how we behave. They see what we do. They see what we don't do. They hear our words. They measure them against what they see of our deeds. They consider that we have claimed our identity as Christians, and they weigh whether or not they would like to come to that light or avoid it altogether. Also, we need to be honest. In the Lutheran Church, in the course of its history, there have been moments in its history when it has certainly attempted to leave its candle underneath a bushel for the purposes of self-preservation of the institutional church. It has happened. Just the other day I saw a picture of a bunch of clergy people, both Roman Catholic and Lutheran, dressed up in their cassocks and from the 1930s and giving the Sieg Heil in front of the camera. We have in our history times when that has been the case. Lutherans prior to the Civil War, do you know that they voted not to talk about slavery or abolition? They voted not to talk about slavery or abolition because it might be too church dividing, like it was with the Presbyterians. Today you're going to you'll hear all the time. If you've said this, forgive me for saying it out loud in the church, but I'm going to say it out loud in the church. Very often, the worst thing that a pastor can do in a church is be too political. And that's true. It is very often the worst thing a pastor can do in the church is be too political. But there ought to be a little bit of self-scrutiny about that too. How much of us do not, the reason being usually is given, lest we give offense. Lest we offend people who don't agree with the political position that we take. But my friends, it is the truth. It is the truth that when we all have been given the light and we seek to protect it so that we don't upset one another, you know what happens? We don't have the Church of Jesus Christ. That's not our identity. We have a social club that we don't want to disrupt. And there are times when it comes to the suffering of people in the world, in our nation, in ever so many places, when widows are not taken care of and sojourners, strangers in the land, are treated without a welcome and with hurt and violence, and when orphans are not cared for, is a moment to remember that we are salt and we are light for the world. And sometimes that means we're political. And when it's uncomfortable, the word polis, from which political comes, and so also does police, but polis not only means a center of administration, but it also means a community of citizens. Back back in the day, back in the war, during the war, there was a Lutheran pastor, World War. When I say the war, I just realized, okay, pick one, because there are an awful lot of them, aren't there? Number 2, there was a Lutheran pastor named Martin Niemöller. And I'm not going to remember exactly, but he wrote that beautiful piece of material about when they came for the gypsies. I was not a gypsy, so I didn't speak out. When they came for the Jews, I was not a Jew, so I didn't speak out. I don't know if you guys have seen that. It floats around every so often. It's kind of a long thing. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out. And what he was saying in that was that he was not that person. He was not that political pastor. He was not that one that stepped out in front and said, this far and no farther. This is where Christ stands. This is who we take. He was not that guy. But then they began to take away the people of his congregation, the men and the women. And he had a change of heart. He had a transformation. He suddenly realized that as salt and as light and as polis, there had to be a statement. He wrote this. He said, "It is only during these days that I have realized that I have understood what the Lord Jesus Christ meant when he says, 'Do not take up the bushel. I've not lit the candle for you to put it under the bushel in order to protect it from the wind. Away with the bushel. The light should be placed on a candlestick. It is not your business to worry about whether the light's extinguished or not by the draft. We are not to worry whether the light is extinguished or not. That is God's concern. That is God's concern. We are only to see that the light is not hidden away. Hidden away perhaps with a noble intent, so that we may bring it out again in nobler times, calmer times. No. Let your light so shine before others. Let your light so shine before others. So you're salt, and you're light, and you're polis. Now, what is your relationship to the law? I'm saying this because Lutherans, sometimes we are free from the law, and that means we don't have to pay any attention to it, and that whether or not we do it is a big old, it doesn't matter very much, because God forgives, there's grace, and there you are. But Jesus is very clear. He says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. If you were a Pharisee, if that were your identity, here's what you'd care about. You wouldn't comb your hair on the Sabbath. And I'd be looking at a whole mess of other different kinds of people. You wouldn't do that because it might be work. Not that it is work, but it might be work. If you're a Pharisee, you'd cover up your mirrors so that you wouldn't see your bedhead in the morning, so that you wouldn't be tempted to comb it out, because that might be work. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, it's got to be more than that, better than that, deeper than that, beyonder than that. And I'm not talking about mount your 10 commandments in a courthouse, but the law that Jesus has in mind, the law that the prophets talk about, the law that is not going to be passed away, not one jot or one tittle until all comes in its entirety. That law, he has shown you, O mortal, we heard it last week, what is good, but that you do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God. Today you hear it in Isaiah. Is this the fast that I choose? Is this the fast that I choose? Sackcloth and ashes. Seriously, symbolic stuff? Here's the fast I care about, justice. Feed the hungry. Care for the orphan and the widow and the alien. Invite the homeless poor into your house. This is what it means to be salt and light. Jesus says. See, he's not worried about combs. He's not worried about bedhead. He's worried about the weightier matters of the law of love. Justice. Remember the Good Samaritan? Why that story is such a big important story. Sometimes it gets a little lost on us. We forget the Samaritans and the Judean Jews. They don't have anything to do with each other. And the Samaritan's walking down the road and sees a Judean Jew lying in the ditch. And Judean priests and Levites and others have passed by on the other side so as not to mess with their keeping the law. Because if they go over there, if they're going to do something for that guy, then they have to richly take care of the whole purity thing, and it'll just ruin their day because they cannot go to where they have important things to do. I might be filling in some details on that story that aren't exactly there, but you catch the drift. But what makes it so incredible is that the Samaritan follows the law of love. And he crosses the road not for somebody that's of his own kind, but for somebody who is wounded, for somebody who is lying in a ditch. Yes, the Old Testament may say not to eat pork and not to eat shellfish, but that's not really the heart of the law. The heart of the law is what the Samaritan does for that man lying in a ditch. You are salt and you are light. Everything has to do with the love of God and your neighbor. If the Samaritan follows the letter of the law, that man dies in the ditch. Then he's not salt, he's not light, and he's not polis. You, though, are. For the purposes of God, for the sake of the man in the ditch, that is your identity. And it may not resolve the question when somebody said, help us to find our identity. That's what I mean by your identity. I didn't help you look for how you operate in the world because I think I'm not very skillful at that sort of thing. I looked at who you are and who God is. And you are salt, and you are light, and you are loved, and you are sent. Paul writes to the Corinthians, he says, when I came to you, I didn't talk with lofty words of wisdom and all that stuff. I resolved to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. If you remember that, so what I said when I came. First day, first Sunday. I resolved to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I offer that to you again and again and again as the thing which you have to share with the whole world. This is the salt, this is the light that you have received. This crucified God who keeps on getting up and sending you forth. You are salt. You are light. Amen.